Welcome to the April 2020 webinar of the Mid-Michigan Livestock Network. My name is Cable Thurlow. I'm a beef and grazing educator with Michigan State University Extension. The April 2020 webinar features Dr. Richard Ehrhardt, small ruminant specialist at Michigan State University, and our topic is understanding forage quality and its analysis. Richard Ehrhardt has been the small ruminant specialist at Michigan State University since 2009. Holding a joint appointment between the Departments of Animal Science and Large Animal Clinical Sciences. He received his bachelor's in animal science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his graduate training, a master's degree and a PhD from Cornell University. His interest in extension and applied research were fostered by a diversity of experience with sheep, including purebred sheep during his youth, shearing professionally since his early teens, field research in New Zealand and Australia, and managing his own flock of commercial ewes on an accelerated lambing program for the past 20 years. His applied research interests revolve around increasing production efficiency in small ruminants through strategic nutritional management, optimizing aseasonal reproduction, improving whole farm forage utilization, and by establishing preventative health programs. This is the contact information for Dr. Ehrhardt. Please feel free to contact him if you have any questions regarding this recording. And I hope you all enjoy the webinar.
Good evening, everyone. Pleased to visit with you today. It's nice to connect at least this way. And today, Cable said, hey, I'd like you to talk about forage quality. And I said, hey, I'll give it my best shot. So I'm going to cover this topic as best I can from my unique point of view. First of all, I'm going to discuss, why this is important. And then what are the major impacts on forage quality. Try to give you like a good basic introduction to what are the basic measurements, and then we're going to look at some forage quality reports and go over those. And really, forage quality is really important to the bottom line of any ruminant animal program, whether it be sheep, goats, cattle. It's really determines the nutritional value of this major feed ingredient. And it's important to understand how to manage it and kind of know where you're at in your management scheme in terms of managing quality versus yield and those sorts of relationships. So really what it does, it just determines how much forage an animal consume. So high quality forage is much more digestible. It's not as bulky. Animals can eat more. And I'll show you some figures on that. So it's, if you allow them to eat to their limit, if it's highly digestible forage, it'll have what's called a higher rate of passage. In other words, it'll pass through their system faster, and they'll be able to eat more in a single day in any unit time. And so that's really important to understand, is what their intake is when you feed animals. And the higher quality, the greater the intake. Okay, so forage quality determines intake. And the consequence of that is it also determines really how much supplement you might need to meet an animal's requirements. So it kind of sets the stage. The forage varies in quality quite a bit relative to other feedstuffs. So that's why it's so important to understand the quality of forage. Generally, if we want to get really refined, yes, there are differences in the nutritional value of grain, but it's not nearly as variable, of course, as the quality of forage because of things like maturity and time of harvest. So it determines how much supplement you might need to add. And generally speaking, supplements are going to be more expensive, not all the time. So that's another kind of sidebar here, but understanding that forages kind of set the stage for need to supplement is certainly important, and is just an important concept here. In addition, understanding quality is going to allow a farmer to maximize returns when selling and minimizing cost when buying forage. So the value is definitely dictated by forage quality. So most of us would larger, especially larger, more commercial oriented forage sellers are going to give you forage value reports, and they're going to price their forage on its value. Often forage is valued on a term called relative forage value, or RFV, which I'll discuss later. And so understanding what that's all about is important in knowing, first of all, how you might want to sell your forages, and also what RFV means for quality in terms of buying forages. So I'll talk about that later on. So where does this all start? Well, I think fundamentally, it's important to understand that forage quality is really uh, determined or dictated by the cell wall component of the plant. So here we have a plant cell wall, and if you, uh, I have to harken back to the days of botany to remember what a plant cell wall looks like, but they're rigid like this, they're thick, and they're structural, and they're full of cellulose. They become also more enriched in something called lignin, which is another substance that um, sort of uh, forms a matrix with cellulose, and lignin's actually very indigestible. Cellulose by itself, which becomes a much greater fraction of a cell wall as the plant mature, varies in its digestibility. Then we have hemicellulose, which is a more digestible form of cellulose. These are all like the major parts of a cell wall, and these are what we're evaluating. Largely, these three substances are what we're trying to evaluate in forage quality estimates. Okay, and so as these plant cell walls thicken and the plant matures and it becomes more stiff and rigid, these constituents become a greater portion of the plant and also become less digestible. So I'll talk about both those concepts. There's also other important things to understand about forage quality relate to its sugar, starch, fat, protein, pectin, which is a more soluble form of protein, or excuse me, carbohydrate. Um, all these are part of the cell contents of a plant. And generally, as a plant matures, its relative amount of cell content to cell wall changes, becomes much less. So when a plant's very vegetative and mature, it's going to have a lot of these highly digestible, soluble cell contents. And then as it becomes more mature, it becomes more full of cellulose, fills up, and also becomes more full of lignin. And so these two relative proportions change. And that's really the fundamental part of understanding forage quality. So how can you determine, like measure how much cellulose is in the plant and how much of it's digestible? Well, here's just a kind of a schematic here showing you where the cell wall components fit and the cell contents fit, and in terms of the substances that constitute these various fractions, and then also how they're measured chemically. Okay, so we have here a bunch of acronyms. I'm sorry, that's kind of what we've got here, but this one here called ADF is a special fraction, refers to acid digestible fiber. Okay, and this here, oops, um, NDF is termed neutral digestible fiber. So ADF is a subfraction of NDF, and these are the major parts of the cell wall that are vary in digestibility quite a bit. Okay, there's also other parts of the cell wall that are like pectin, mucilages, and gums are often called, and those are more digestible and aren't contained within these NDF and ADF fractions. So you get a forage report. One of the big things you're going to look at is this NDF fraction, which consists of all of these components, and then also the ADF fraction, which is a subfraction of NDF. So that's really the important part here. Okay, and there's other carbohydrates in the plant as well that are much more digestible, that are all contained in all of these various fractions. And actually, this is a schematic by a lady named Mary Beth Hall, who was a grad student, colleague of mine at Cornell. So we actually graduated at this, I think, pretty much the same year. And she's a real expert in this area. Okay, forage quality. Again, it's determined by the composition and digestibility of the cell wall fraction, and here's the major constituents as I've described, and the digestibility varies. So cellulose is generally fairly indigestible, but it varies quite a bit, and that variation is what we need to understand. I'll get to that in just a minute. Hemicellulose is relatively more digestible, and lignin is just pretty terrible. So you can actually look at lignin content, which is reported in your forage report as well, as a pretty good mark of bad forage. So when lignin content goes up, it's very indigestible. It's really high in ADF or acid digested fiber, and that means poor quality. So that in itself is a pretty good marker of quality. So yeah, the implications are that this digestibility, so how digestible these various components are, really determines the energy and protein available to the animal. Also, the micronutrients like minerals and vitamins also ride right along with this. So it also determines how much how available these are to the animal and how much it can eat. More digestible forage means they can eat more, and it's got richer energy and protein density.
I have a quick question for you, Dr. Earhart.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Go back to that slide if you could. So last year was an interesting year in my area, at least, and we didn't make first cutting hay. We were way late. What does that do to those numbers?
Yeah, that means everything. Maturity is the major driver of this. So as your hay cutting's delayed for whatever reason, weather, equipment breakdown, maybe just because you might choose to do that for whatever reason, the digestibility is going to go way down. The amount of cellulose is going to go up. Digestibility is going to go down. It's going to be highly lignified as it becomes more mature. And actually, I've got some moving on in the. I can address that a couple more times and reinforce that concept with a few more figures that I've got that show kind of relative cutting date and quality. So it's really what it's all about. So just what Cable asked, really, it's plant maturity is the biggest factor. Okay, so the more mature it is, the later the cutting date, it determines everything. It's the major factor. There's other more subtle things like growing conditions. If you have relatively cooler temperatures that are sunny, you tend to have a little more digestible forage. Everything else the same. If it's hot, likewise, you get more lignin, less digestible cellulose. So that makes a difference too. And then plant species matter as well, whether they're the type of grass it might be, whether it's a cool season grass, like most of the forages we see, or a warm season grass. Corn's a warm season grass, but we've got like switchgrass. A lot of the prairie grasses are these warm season grasses. Generally speaking, warm season grasses, unless plant breeders selected them, are generally less digestible than cool season grasses. All of them, though, become far less digestible as they mature. Legumes, interestingly, tend to be slightly less digestible in um, in terms of the amount of NDF they have relative to grasses. But as I'll show you, they tend to hold their value longer, and there's less of a steep relationship between maturity and quality in legumes. And most of you can kind of get a picture of that when you think about it. As alfalfa gets really, really mature, it still has a lot of leaves, and those leaves are pretty decent. It has a lot of stems too, of course, but those leaves kind of keep some quality factor, whereas grass, the leaves actually just fill up with cellulose and they make the whole plant fairly indigestible. So there's a steeper kind of curve there. I'll show you that in a minute. Yeah, so the important measures I've kind of introduced, and here they're defined a little more formally. We have NDF, neutral detergent fiber. This is the kind of the total cell wall fraction, or nearly the total cell wall fraction. What it is basically, it's I'll describe it in a second too, but you basically take this plant, you incubate it under high temperature, you basically boil it in detergent, and what it does is it solubilizes everything but this fiber, and so what's left behind is this fiber called NDF. Um, then you can take this NDF. Not all NDF was created the same, so that makes a little more of a complexity. But you take this NDF fraction then, and then you can measure how digestible it is, because it varies. And what you do to do that is kind of interesting. You take that fraction and you actually incubate it in rumen fluid. So what they do in the lab is they harvest rumen fluid from cows that are fistulated, means they have like a little port into the rumen. They collect this fluid, which is full of all the microbes that are digest fiber, and then they incubate it for different periods of time, 24, 48, 72 hours. And then that gives you the true measure of digestibility. That digestibility is probably your best indicator of feed intake. Um, and so those are things that the lab can do. And then the other important measure, again, as I've described, is called ADF. ADF is this acid detergent fiber. So this is taking this detergent, acidifying it, which actually breaks down some of the less digestible components of fiber. And what's left behind with ADF is mostly stuff that really is poorly digestible. So it's mostly indigestible cellulose and lignin. So the person who came up with these methodologies is a guy named Peter Van Soest, who is actually was pretty cool. I actually know him, I'm friends with him. He's the guy who designed this whole system back in the early 60s. And when I came to Cornell as a grad student, I thought he was like one of these, people who had deceased 30 years ago. I mean, because I read all about his work, and I thought he was from some bygone era, but he's this living legend. He's a really nice guy, and he loves students and teaching. And so I was really fortunate to be able to meet him. And I'm not saying I became super well educated in this area, but he's a neat guy and kind of a living legend for me. So he was a fiber chemist. He understood that these detergents could give a great power in describing fiber digestibility and fractionating it. So these methods are used all over the world, and really the standard methods for understanding forage quality is the Van Soest methods, which are the NDF and ADF fractions. So NDF can also be used as a quality target for harvest. So if you want to harvest your forage for quality, we'd like the NDF content to stay for legumes less than 40, for grasses less than 55. And I look at that pretty closely when I look at forage reports. I find that if I keep my grasses in particular in that level, they're generally very digestible. So legumes and grasses are both going to accumulate NDF as they mature, but if you keep them at this level, generally have pretty good match of quality and yield. That's what you're always trying to do when you grow forage. You'd like to have high quality forage, but we want to make sure you have enough. I mean, you can't go and harvest your forage next week, right? Because you just have grass clippings and there would be hardly any yield. Quality would be awesome, but there wouldn't be so much yield. So you're trying to, maximize your return of quality forage. And that's what these levels do. These also translate, like who's going to actually measure this on their forage? Not many, but you can look at indicators of plant maturity. So for legumes, that's going to be it's going to be when they're just about ready to bloom, that pre-bloom stage. For grasses, that 55% NDF, like if you looked at orchard grass, for example, you'd see what we call boot stage, where it's just starting to head out. If you get quite a few heads on the grass, it's going to start rising above 55. If there's barely any heads in the grass, it's going to be around 50. So let's just give you some other indicators. But if you actually measured it chemically, you'll see that they match really well, those stages. So here's just another representation of that. Here we have grass, and it shows you how, of course, it's dry matter grows way up. Cellulose content goes way up as it matures, as it hits, here we have vegetative, here we have it kind of in the boot stage, here we have it fully seeded out, here we have it thinking about dying. It's starting to get brown. This would be that 4th of July forage cable. This would probably be maybe the middle of June. This would be about June 1, and this would be about May 15th. Depends, I guess. That's taking some liberty there because we all live in different parts of Michigan. But part of Michigan I live in, southern Michigan, that'd be about right. You move north, this might shift a week or two, but that gives you a sense for kind of how it looks. So you can see lignin.
I had a
Go ahead.
question come in for you.
Oh yeah.
Mike had a question, and he wanted to, are these percentages based upon as sampled basis or a dry matter basis?
Yeah, great question. Those are dry matter basis samples. So yeah, wet forage is going to be, fresh forage is going to be, 80% water or even a little bit more. So that's definitely on a dry matter basis. Okay. Yeah, so the methods that we use, again, just to describe them again, I think I already said this pretty well, but I'll just go over it. So it's, again, NDF is measured by incubating it, and what leaves behind is this fiber. NDF digestibility is, again, incubating it with room and fluid for various time points. So you can indicate on your forage report, like when you send it in to get sampled, you can say, hey, I want NDF digestibility measured at these various time points. And I would say the standard one's usually 48 hours. That's what I choose. Generally, it's reached kind of its maximum. There isn't a whole lot more digestion going on. That's kind of a standard time point. Because you incubate it longer, it'll digest just a little bit more. And again, ADF, again, is just the same detergent essentially, but with acidic conditions. So mostly indigestible stuff left over. Okay. And just to remind us what that looks like, ADF again is this less digestible cellulose and lignin component. NDF contains that plus hemicellulose. Okay. So how do these translate into other things that we need to understand for animal nutrition? So we can also get estimates of energy content, which is highly related to digestibility, and protein content from forages. Okay. Now, when we look at the energy content of a forage, there's different ways that we can look at that. And many times the choice that we might choose, the choice for energy content that you might want is going to be somewhat dependent on the species that you raise, because the requirements for energy for like dairy cattle, for example, are often expressed on what's called a net energy basis, whereas those for sheep and beef cattle are more likely to be on what's called an ME, or metabolizable energy basis. Or also, very similarly, ME and TDN are these are all interrelated. They're different ways of measuring energy. TDN stands for total digestible nutrients. I know these all sound fairly technical terms, but basically, for my knowledge, your knowledge, it's important to understand that these are just all different ways of measuring energy. And whether you raise dairy cows, beef cows, or sheep, you might choose to focus on one or the other. The one you might choose to focus on depends on your species. For example, I know what the TDN needs of sheep are. I also know what the ME needs of sheep are, and that energy requirements are not as well defined, whereas in dairy cows, they are. So actually, what all of these are measured from is a very simple thing. It's measured by ADF content. So when you send in your, to actually truly measure these, you would have to do animal studies and look at metabolism and look at digestibility of forage. So what do these labs do? They just measure ADF chemically, and then they have prediction equations that they use to estimate each of these fractions from ADF.
Got
So
another question for you when you get a chance.
Yep, they're all derived from ADF. What's that?
Emily asks, for stockpiled forage for fall winter grazing, are those plants dormant but still highly digestible and nutritious? And then a second question, what stage of growth are those stockpiled plants?
Yeah, so stockpiled forage, it's basically, its qualities dictated by two things, like basically the life stage it was at when it sort of died or stopped growing, and then how much it might decompose or leach under the snow or in the weather. Okay, so let's say, and so that life stage is going to be determined by when it was last harvested. So if you grazed it versus machine harvested, doesn't really matter. But like if you were to stop grazing August 1 versus September 1 will make a big difference. If you were to have a pasture you want to stockpile and it was harvested one way or another August 1, when it actually hits, say middle November when it stops growing or early November, it'll be much more mature than if it was last harvested September 1, right? Because it's just lived longer. It might even be close to being seeded out, probably not. So the quality will be a little lower. Then the other factor again is, how many freeze thaw cycles happened in the month of November, December, January, how much snow cover you have. All these things determine how much nutrients leach out of it. So it won't really change. It'll change. The fiber content will be kind of set, but the content of the cell wall or the cell solubles, like the other parts of the plant that determine its quality, will start to leach out. So it'll be relatively more fibrous as it leaches out. So anyhow, yeah, basically it's dictated by time of last harvest, the quality of stockpiled forage. And as far as their quality goes, when we've measured quality, it can be very, very high. It can be almost as good as, spring grass. Usually not quite as good because it's tended to leach a little bit, but it can be really excellent. I mean, a lot of times stockpiled grass that's not is still vegetative because it's cool in the fall, so it doesn't mature as fast, so it tends to keep its quality a little longer. Uh, that grass can be easily TDN values in the mid 60s and protein values in the teens or in the mid like 15%. So it can be very, very good. The other thing, of course, that we look at in quality is protein, and that's very simple. We measure that in terms of crude protein. It can be more complex, but I'm going to keep it as simple as I can for this discussion. So crude protein is simply the nitrogen content of the plant, which they measure chemically, times 6.25. There's other aspects of protein nutrition that might be important to understand, like it's how it degrades in the rumen and things like that. But basically, most of your forage report you're going to get is basically a crude protein estimate. Okay. There's no reason to show this picture to you, except I just was getting sick of text slides. So here's a picture of some nice looking sheep grazing some, looks like the forage here, looks like it's going to be pretty high quality. You don't see hardly any seed heads. And I tell you, this picture was taken about June 1 in central New York. So as far as legumes and grasses go, they do vary in their forage chemistry. So legumes are going to have higher protein at the same degree of maturity. So they're relatively more proteinaceous than grasses. That's not to say that grasses can't be high in protein. They just tend to lose their protein content, if you will, or it gets diluted out more quickly than legumes in a relative sense. Grasses do also have higher NDF at the same degree of maturity. So, you look at if you have a grass that's not quite seeded out, it does have more NDF. However, its digestibility of the NDF is a little bit greater. So that kind of counterbalances a little bit. So you can see here this digestibility is a little bit higher than the NDF of legumes, okay? So if we were to look at its quality in terms of its growth stage, in terms of its cutting date, assuming that we're doing a single cutting, what the animal can actually consume in a day as a percentage of its body weight, and compare that to its digestibility, we see that these vegetative forages that are there's no seed heads yet, the animals can eat. These cattle can eat quite a bit more of that forage. You can see that it's very digestible, and that this digestibility goes down pretty markedly over time, and so does the intake of the ability of the animal to consume it. And these are just relative digestibilities, these fractions. uh, corrected for an index of 100. Okay. Um, so here's another way of looking at it. We're looking at on the one axis, we have 48-hour in vitro NDF digestibility. So this is how digestible NDF is. On the other axis, we have the percentage of NDF. So that's shown by the solid line here, is how much NDF is in the plant. And here we have these bar showing us how digestible the NDF is, okay? So this on the left panel is for grass, and this on the right panel is for legumes, okay? So put your favorite species in there and it'll fit pretty well. And here's the growth stages of plants. So basically, as they become more mature, okay, as they grow, you have the digestibility is very steeply going down in grasses. See how it declines pretty quickly? And then the NDF content goes up. So as NDF content, digestibility go in opposite directions, okay? Now, if we compare that to legumes, let's assume this is alfalfa. Interestingly, they start off not quite as high as grasses. That's kind of why I was saying that grasses get kind of poor rep as having poor digestibility. They're actually really awesome when they're in the early vegetative stage, like the grass you see outside. I've actually had animals break loose during this period of time and bloat on grass because it's just so digestible. It's a lot like high quality legume forage at that point. At any rate, so we see legumes here, they have a much steeper decay curve in terms of looking at their digestibility, and they don't ever quite hit the same low point because they still retain their leaves, okay? So this is mostly explained by leaf to stem ratios. But you can see that they kind of hit a max here. Not as, but if you look here, these curves are different. So the NDF content of grasses is much higher, 70% when they're fully mature. And then the NDF content of legumes is always going to be less, even when it's fully mature. So when Cable was asking me what those late maturing forages look like, a lot of them would be around in here in the mid 60s. As soon as NDF and grasses get in the mid 60s, I can pretty much tell you what its quality is, and that's not so great. This hay here, that's harvested at 70%, that's almost, I mean, you have to chop that up. Think about using it as bedding or feed it to your really maintenance animals because it's not going to have much quality. This stuff here will still have a lot of leaves in it, but it'll leave a lot of stems behind, okay? And so that should give you a pretty good idea of how those things interrelate between grasses and legumes. Same basic concept here without quite as much detail. Basically, it's all a function of date of harvest. So here we have in the red NDF or yield. So NDF accumulates, crude protein or NDF digestibility goes down, okay, as over time. So what are you looking for to harvest it? You'd probably like to be somewhere in this range, right? You want quality, but you want some yield as well. So you have to have enough yield to harvest it, but you don't want its quality to go way down. So depending on how your system is, and the challenge, of course, is this date you can't always control unless you've got control over the weather or control over the moisture, ability to harvest forage at a more moist condition. So if you can make silage, you're more likely to hit this target. If you're making dry hay, you're not going to be able to get in there until probably somewhere in here a lot of years, like last year. Even last year, with all the rain we had, it was pretty hard to even get it at this stage with silage making. I found like basically one day when I could cut that I could dry it enough because it rained almost every day to get this kind of quality, right? So that's always a challenge. Okay. So again, I think I already said this in another slide. These are some targets you'd use for harvesting forages for machine harvest. And pretty much because you can't measure this, you want to think about it being that just pre-bud stage. You don't want to see too many flowers. And then for grasses, you don't want to see too many seed heads. So you'd like it to be in that boot stage when the seeds are just cropping out of the plant. and that late vegetative stage is important indicator to look at. So again, the way you control this is just harvesting according to maturity indicators, that plant growth stage. You can monitor NDF to see what that's like. Mostly it's already done by the time you monitor it, but you'll at least know what the quality is, how much NDF is, and know how to feed it then. As far as machine harvest goes, of course, dry hay programs are going to have weather constraints, and that's a big factor. As far as controlling forage quality of grazing, it's you have more control. Basically, you have to consider what your rotation length is going to be. So that's a lot of reason why a lot of people who do grazing systems are going to maybe harvest a relatively small amount of their farm early in the spring with grazing, so they can keep that rotation short. Because if you keep that short rotation, you're going to have more vegetative grass and higher quality for them to eat. As you start to run out of forage, you harvest more of your forage by grazing. For example, my own farm, I have a sheep farm, and in the spring, say I've got, the percentage of my farm that I graze is probably 15-20% during the month of May. During the month of June, I'm harvesting 25% by grazing, and I machine harvest all the rest so I can keep that quality. So I focus on quality with grazing or machine harvest, and as the grass growth accelerates, or slows down, the opposite, I have to graze a greater proportion of my land. And that way I can maintain quality. As far as measuring quality, then, I've discussed this a little bit already, but here are two major indicators of forage quality that are used in the industry. One of them is called RFV, which you've probably seen on a forage report, and that simply means relative forage value. Okay, so relative forage value uses an index of 100, which is the relative forage value they've chosen of full bloom alfalfa. So, you consider the value of full bloom alfalfa, that's set as the indicator of 100. And so it's used to compare forages. It's certainly valid when you compare alfalfa base forages, because it kind of has an alfalfa basis for its index, okay? The way it's measured, I don't have the formula to show you here, but it basically uses ADF and NDF, as I've described, as its major factors. So it's a kind of just an equation, plug in the amount of ADF, plug in the amount of NDF, and it gives you RFV. What it does, however, if you like grasses and you grow grasses, and your animals do well on grasses, it's going to underestimate the value of grasses every single time. That's important to understand, because if you're a forage buyer and you've got some grass content, you can buy those forages that have grass in them more inexpensively, as I'll describe. The other way that another index of forage quality is called RFQ, which is simply relative forage quality. This came about later in response to the need to have a more accurate measure of true animal performance. So RFV is mostly chemically derived. RFQ is based more on true digestibility. So again, knowing the digestibility of this, how it digests in rumen fluid, gives us a pretty good indicator of performance. And that's how RFQ is measured. It's actually the true value quality of the forage. So it gives a more fair playing field for grasses versus legumes, because it is derived from actually digestibility, not just a chemical measure, okay, from NDF and ADF. So here's kind of a graph to illustrate this relationship. So I have RFV here on this axis, RFQ here on the X, and what we see is grasses here are shown by little green triangles, and alfalfa is red boxes, okay, and red squares. And what we see is alfalfa sits on a straight line. So these are very interrelated. RFV and RFQ have a tight relationship with alfalfa. However, with grass, you can see that grasses are always higher in relative forage quality than they are in relative feed value. So a grass that's 125 RFV is actually going to be like 175 in RFQ, okay? Whereas alfalfa is going to be pretty consistent. Like its RFV and RFQs are going to be pretty similar, okay? So that means like if you had some high quality grass forage you were going to buy and they were selling it at an RFV, you're going to get a pretty good deal. That's how I buy my forage. When I buy some forage, I just bought a bunch of forage late in the season because I didn't have as much because of the factors Cable mentioned, how we didn't get in our fields on time. So I went in and bought a bunch of fairly high grass content forage that was around 120, 110 RFV, so it was much cheaper. This guy was selling 200 level stuff, and it's priced exactly on RFV, so that cost twice as much as stuff I bought. But turns out its RFQ was really high. It was more like 175, and my sheep did as well on that as they would have on 175 alfalfa, which would have cost 50% more. So that's important to understand. Okay, so high quality grasses always have high RFQ and low RFV. So you need to buy grasses on RFV. But then if you're producing grass, you'd like to sell it on RFQ if you could. So that's another way of thinking about it because you'll get more, it'll show up, okay, as higher quality. So as far as forage analysis goes, what you need to do to go through this process is to do a good job sampling your forages. So you need a nice representative sample of your forage, and that's very critical because if you don't get a good representative sample, you know, what's the point of testing it really, okay? So sampling is important, and then you need to know which test to run, and I'll go over that. And then you need to understand what the heck these quality analyses mean, and I'll try to go over that. So for haze sampling, you'd like to get a bunch of independent samples from a couple different bales. I mean, I'd like to have 15 different cores if I could, to actually get a representative sample. Okay, if you grab a grab sample from forage, which if you don't have an actual testing probe, you're going to get a skewed view of that forage. It's far better to invest in a small hay corer to get a true representative sample so you don't, you know, underestimate leaf content, okay? So that's important. As far as forage analysis options go, there's basically two main choices you would pick when you look at a, you know, fill out a forage form. One's called wet chemistry, which is actually true chemistry. They take your sample, they measure ADF and NDF with the methods I described, boiling it in detergent, boiling it in acid detergent, sticking it in rumen fluid, okay? This is it's better to use that on your real common forages, probably more accurate. Does cost a little more money. It's going to cost you probably $25. I haven't looked recently. And it's going to take longer to get your results. The other option you can have is a much more automated system, which relies on NIR, or near infrared spectroscopy. Okay, so this is a very different method, but it does a pretty good job of approximating what chemistry can tell you on forages with a lot of data on them. What kind of forages are those? Alfalfa. There's so much data on alfalfa. You can get really good estimates of forage quality using NIR, and most grasses as well. Corn silage certainly would fit because there's so much data on those. If you get some kind of different kind of forage, like for example, one forage I'm interested in knowing the quality of for my research are brassicas, like turnips and things like that. You absolutely can't use NIR for those because there just isn't a very big database on them. So the advantage are that you get fast results, it's cheaper. Like an NIR estimate might cost, you know, 15 bucks tops. You might get it in about 36 hours. That's how fast you can get those. The disadvantage is they need a lot of data. So basically what NIR does, it runs it through a spectroscopy, it runs this spectroanalysis of the forage. And let me actually, to my next slide. So it's infrared rays, and they interact with the plant material and produces like a distinct sort of chromatograph, it's called. And what that'll tell you is, it identifies a certain bonds that are present, certain amounts of protein, fat, all have these characteristic footprints that show up in this graph that you run, and then they can analyze those and compare those, what we call absorption patterns or chromatographs, of a lot of samples to what you get by measuring wet chemistry of the exact same samples. So they see this little spike on the chromatograph and its relative amount. They say, hey, if it's really high in this range, that means there's a lot of NDF. So they can take those and really what's called calibrate the chromatographs to the wet chemistry samples. And so that's what you do. These chromatographs become very good fingerprints of true chemical methods. And since they're fast and easy to run, much faster than doing chemistry, it's a preferred method for high throughput, and becomes a very accurate indicator as well. So again, its accuracy is much greater on forage species that are common, as I've just described earlier. Okay. There's different forage testing laboratories. I'm not trying to suggest that any of these are better than others necessarily, just a couple choices. There's others as well. I did not make an exhaustive list, so I'm not advocating any of these over the next. I just have a lot of experience using Dairy One because I went to school at my university where I went to school was at the town where that lab's located, so I'm very familiar with that lab. Generally, I go with that one, but Litchfield, Cumberland are all perfectly great labs that have certified methodologies. They run the same methodology, and I'm pretty confident you would find very good similarity in how these different labs would measure forage. Here's the price, maybe from a year or two ago, for basic NIR versus wet chemistry will cost you more generally. Generally, you're going to pay a little more if you want the mineral content of the forage, because that is more of a chemical method, and that requires an extra investment. I generally look at minerals on just some forages, not all. Unless it isn't like a common thing I run for most of my forages. You're generally going to get results pretty fast. So NIR, you can get really quick. Like I'll send in samples for my research, and I'll get them back, 3 days after. Basically they get there in the mail and they run them the next day. So it's super fast. Wet chemistry will take 3 or 4 days usually. Okay, so apologies if these are a little bleary. I did my best to try to copy these into here, but here's an example forage report and the kind of information you get back. So here's a sample that I sent in from my own farm many years ago. I remember this was a grass, a new seeding. I remember, so actually when I very first moved here, I created a new seeding of basically fescue, orchard grass, alfalfa. I also had some perennial ryegrass in it in a new seeding as kind of a nurse crop or initial crop. And this was cut as baled silage in late May. It's high energy and very digestible. So this is a silage cutting. So let's just go through the different components. So we see that its moisture level is about 51% water. So it's a little more water. So it's pretty wet stuff, which means it's going to ferment pretty well as a silage. It's crude protein here everything's expressed here on a wet matter and then on a dry matter basis next to it. This dry matter is decent. It's 14%. It doesn't have a whole lot of alfalfa in it. It's probably a little bit lower in crude protein than I might have thought it would be, but it's okay. And as we move down here, we have its ADF content, which I talked about quite a bit. It's about 32. That's a pretty good hallmark of a decent grass. And its NDF is in the low 50s, which is good. Once it gets up to be 55, you'll see that quality goes way down. Other important things to look at here are its TDN content, which is 70, which is actually very good. This TDN content, again, is dictated by the ADF content. Relatively low ADF means high TDN. So this is a pretty decent forage. Your animals are, if you have cows, are going to make some milk on this. Your sheep are gonna, and your cattle are gonna actually gain some weight on this forage, because that's higher, definitely higher than our maintenance kind of diet energy concentrate or energy densities you'd want. What you see here is this RFV is 112, okay, which isn't that great, but its RFQ, because it's grass, is very high. So this is a pretty good indicator of how it's going to feed and how the animals are going to gain on it. Whereas this, so I wish I could buy this for 112 and sell it at 178, right? Okay, so it's moderate protein, has great RFV and average RFQ, and that's simply because it's got a high grass content. Okay.
Dr. Ehrhardt, we have a question.
Yep.
Somebody asked if pH was critical.
Yeah, I left that out of this report because pH is very important for silage, and there is a pH of value for this forage. You want the pH of the silage to be sort of 4, so it's got to be pretty acidic, and that's going to be determined by, if you have a good fermentation, it produces a lot of organic acids, propionic acid, acetic acid, hopefully not too much butyric acid. Those acids are obviously going to lower the pH and and they're going to preserve it, and they're going to ultimately kill the microbes in it, so it preserves it. And that low pH is important to see in a silage. Dry hay, it's going to be neutral pH because it's not going to ferment. But yeah, it's an important factor. And I omitted that from here because I wasn't going to talk about silage quality so much as forage quality. So that's why I omitted it. So a little bit too much to fit every little bit and piece of a forage report on this.
Got another question for you. Tony asks us, how does moisture content relate to the amount of intake and amount of nutrients available per pound of feed?
Not much would be a simple answer. Only when the water content gets very high does water limit dry matter intake. Give you an example. When it gets over 90% water, and what kind of forages are 90% water? Not many. One example, though, would be like a turnip, okay, or maybe an onion. Those are very high in water. So when you put animals out, say on bulb turnips, which most of us don't normally do, but I might do it with my sheep late in fall, they might actually be intake limited, dry matter intake limited, because of the water content. People argue that some spring grasses that are super wet and in the low 80s, that sort of thing, you might have water content sort of limiting dry matter intake, but I think in practice, that's a little overstated. Out west, they say, oh, the grass is so watery, it isn't very good. Most of the time, that isn't a factor. It could be under some exceptional conditions, though.
Okay, got questions, a couple more. They're rolling in. That's good.
Cool.
I don't know if you want me to continue reading them or if you want to look at those, if you can see that. I don't know how that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't see the questions.
I'll read them. Okay, so we have another question here. When putting up dry hay, will a preservative impact the numbers in any significant way?
Okay, that's a great question. The preservatives that are generally used with hay are generally a form of organic acid. So mainly they have, it smells like vinegar. Most hay preservatives are acetic acid, and those basically what they do is they allow the forage to be harvested in a more moist content. So, most dry hay, you'd like to see it 15% moisture or less. Whereas you put some acetic acid, some of that vinegar, essentially, spray it on the hay. What it does is it keeps the like the molds and other things that can grow in water from growing. So it kind of keeps the hay from basically overheating and rotting. But it doesn't really impact its quality other than the fact that it keeps it from molding. So that's good, but it isn't really going to add any value to it. It's going to keep it just from decomposing. Other additives, though, that can be added for silage is a little different. You can inoculate silage with some enzymes and some microbes that can help maybe ferment it faster and maybe give you a little better quality. But I think in general, those aren't going to make a world of difference if it's a really good quality silage to begin with. People might get a little bit of bang for their buck with that type of inoculant that's different than a preservative if the forage silage is kind of average quality. That would be my best answer.
Okay, so I've got another one for you. Are RFV and RFQ mostly used when comparing lots of forage, when pricing for buying and selling? Would be the first part of that question. And the second part, do you need those values when figuring optimal nutrition for the animals, or just a crude protein, TDN, ADF, etc.?
Okay. So can you just repeat the first part of the question?
Yes,
I
sir.
got the second. Yeah.
Are RFV and RFQ mostly used when comparing lots of forage lots?
Okay.
Pricing for buying and selling. Emily, if I didn't get that question right, raise your hand and I'll give you my rights.
I'll give it I think I understand the question pretty well. It's just two very interrelated points, and that's great. Yeah, basically, yes. RFV and RFQ are mostly used to value forage for buying and selling. They're not generally used in animal nutrition. Like, you generally don't balance a diet for RFV or RFQ. So that's a great question. You generally balance a diet for, its TDN content, its crude protein content. People will, of course, forages that are high in RFV, RFQ are going to be higher in those things. But yeah, you won't go into the NRC requirements for sheep or cattle and find what is the RFV need of an animal per day. You certainly will find one for TDN or crude protein. But yeah, RFV is just an indicator used for forage quality, mostly for buying and selling it. It doesn't translate directly into animal nutrition terms.
Great, thank you. We're caught up for now.
Cool. All right, good questions. Thanks. It helps when you're doing these webinars and you get good questions like that, because you're like, hey, you guys are paying attention. It makes me a little more excited about teaching too. So I appreciate that as a teacher. Another forage report example here, I have BMR. What the heck is that stand for? Sudan silage. This is another forage I made. I remember the first year I moved here because I knew I didn't have much forage on my farm because I just planted my first pasture. So I rented 10 acres from my neighbor and planted Sudan, BMR Sudan, which grows a whole lot of forage in a hurry. And this was a second cutting I made on August 15th. So BMR actually stands for brown midrib. They just introduced, so it's a transgenic plant. They introduce brown midrib gene into this plant, which makes it less lignified. So it has less lignin, and it has much more digestible. So less lignin, greater digestibility, and this is a warm season grass. So being a warm season grass, we're going to expect it to be relatively less digestible, but the brown midrib gene kind of keeps that in check, and that's why it's there. You also find the brown midrib gene infused or intergressed into corn as well, similarly, to bring some quality and maintain some quality. One of the problems with some of the BMR varieties, especially corn, maybe not always, but it can happen, is because they have less lignin in them, they topple over easily and they fall to the ground. So that's kind of interesting sidebar on that. So this was some silage I remember making. It was pretty wet, so it's 60% water. I could barely get it baled, I remember. because it was pretty wet and I was making baled silage with it and it was pretty tall. I remember driving through this stuff and it was like 5 feet tall and I felt like it was almost got lost in my field cutting it that day. And its crude protein content was pretty great. It was actually 16.5%, which was a pleasant surprise. Its ADF is relatively high, or not that high. It's in the mid 30s. Its NDF is relatively high though. Okay, so it has relatively high NDF. So that's gonna kind of hold back its quality a little bit. But the NDF that it has might be pretty good quality because of this brown midrib gene, which might make it a little bit better than say orchard grass at 60% NDF. It's probably going to be worse. Okay, these are just some little subtleties. Lignin content shown here. TDN content is pretty decent, 65. Your animals, like my animals, are going to maintain their body weight on that pretty well. They're certainly not going to lose a lot of weight. I probably wouldn't get a whole lot of, I might not feed this to my lactating ewes as much, at least, but they're going to do okay on it, certainly. Um, and its relative feed value, though, is expressed kind of low because it's a grass, okay? So poor grass gets undervalued. But its relative forage quality is pretty decent. It's like 140. So again, because of a grass, it has low, um, um, I said that opposite here. Its RFQ is pretty good and its RFE is bad. Sorry about that. I think you can see that. It's got moderate energy, moderate digestibility. So it's an okay forage. There's nothing wrong with it. It's good quality. And I remember this had a good fermentation, which is very important for silage, which again, it'd be nice to have shown you that, but its pH would have been in the 4s or low 4s. When you get pH in the 5s, it's probably not, it's actually borderline in unsafe to feed for some types of animals. Okay, here is some pretty awesome hay that a client sent me a sample from. I didn't produce this. This is some stuff she bought to feed her goats, I remember, about that same fall. So I just have it in the same file in my computer. And I was looking at it. This was like a last cutting hay. So it's kind of that real candy kind of alfalfa just before it frosts. And so we look at this value here. Its moisture was 20%, which is a little bit high for dry hay, but it was that late cutting hay. So it just on that borderline of being a little too wet. I don't know, this stuff might have had some preservative with it, but I don't recall. Its crude protein is pretty nice. It's very high. It's 24, which you'll see in high quality alfalfa. And again, this is cut in the late season, so it's cooler. It's cut at a relatively low immature stage, so it's got very high protein. Chances are there wasn't a whole lot of this in the field, right? It might have been only 8 inches tall, but it was high in protein, certainly. Its ADF is low. Look, it's 24%. That's pretty awesome. Its NDF is in the low 30s. What I told you, you want to harvest your alfalfa before like 38. So this is actually highly vegetative alfalfa. You know, might have been if it would have kept growing, if this growing season would have continued, you wish you could have harvested 20 days later. But obviously, in our climate, you know, it stops growing then. So that's why it was harvested then. So it's a pretty immature alfalfa, unusually high quality. So that should translate into a very high digestibility here. And I forgot to point that out in the other forage reports. Here's that. This is 90% digestible. And its NDF is almost 70, so it's very digestible. Look at its RFQ. It's super high. Its RFV is also very high, over 200 for both. And so this stuff's going to cost you some big cash to buy. And that's what I know. That's what this producer paid for it. So yeah, it's super high quality. Did this producer need this high quality for their livestock? I don't think they probably did, but it certainly was something that was super high quality. They'll make a lot of milk in goats or sheep or goats or cattle. I don't think you'd ever need this quality for like the sheep that I raise, but it'll certainly make some milk because of its high protein content and very, very digestible fiber. Okay. Um, yeah, so to summarize it, it's both high energy It's almost 70%, which is unusual for alfalfa. Alfalfa, when it's harvested at its quality yield kind of um, optimal state, is usually in the low 60s, around 60, which means it's relatively low in energy compared to some grasses, but it's usually in the low 20s then for protein. This stuff is both awesome in protein, awesome in energy, but there's not much of it because it's late cutting. Okay. Um, so what are some of the best practices for managing forage for livestock health, well-being, productivity? Hopefully all of these things, are interrelated factors, and they are, in my opinion. Their health, well-being, and productivity are all completely synonymous for me. So what you want to do is pretty simple. You need to get a representative sample. So you need a sample to understand the quality you have in inventory for especially the forage you're feeding in the wintertime. Send it to a certified lab to test it. And then you want to consider what to do with that information. One of the most important decisions you can make is determine what animals to feed it to. So you allocate it based on its tests. So you reserve the best stuff for the animals with the highest needs, and the mediocre stuff for the animals that just need the coast. They're on maintenance diet, they don't need to gain or lose weight. That's what you use the mature, less digestible forage for. Then, so you allocate it that way, and then you would want to balance the diets by adding supplements to fill in deficits. So, if you only have moderate quality forages and you're trying to feed a lactating animal, or, animals that are just post weaning that need a lot of energy and protein and they need some forage, you're going to add some supplements to that to make up the differences. So that's pretty simple stuff, but basics to understand. Uh, so I'm just about ready to wrap it up here. So make sure you bring some questions to me if you still have any. But to summarize this, so basically forage quality is managed by time of harvest or its maturity, whether that be in a machine harvest system or a grazing system. Grazing system, length of rotation, faster rotations, more vegetative, better quality. Longer rotations, poorer quality. Harvest, time between cuttings, right? Um, I've told this story before, but when I used to live in New York, I worked with a bunch of other sheep producers who we were all trying to sell lambs to this particular market in New York City and get fall lambs born. And that required a little bit more energy consumption of our sheep during the winter to get a good fall lambing. And I could pretty much got to the point where I'd drive around, see my competitors' farms, and look at when they cut their first cutting of hay, and I could pretty much tell you that guy's not going to have many fall lambs next fall. So I'm going to be selling lambs to New York City. And that's what I used to do. And it was pretty much true almost every time. Not only is it forage quality, but generally people who are really on top of managing quality are also going to do other things a little more aggressively on their farms and maybe hit some of these markets and have this availability. All those behaviors kind of go together often. Not everyone needs to focus on forage quality as much as like a dairy farmer or someone trying to do some of the things I still try to do with my sheep production system, but it makes a big difference in your animal productivity in many cases.
We test our forages. We have all kinds of different lots from different fields, different cuttings and everything else.
Mm-hmm.
When I get all these reports back and I'm looking at them, which are the, 2 or 3 or 4, key fractions or components of this that I should be using to be comparing apples to apples when I look across all these different samples? Which ones are the best? Which ones are the worst?
Yeah, well, that's exactly why people have like this RFV and RFQ index, because that's what they're used for. It allows you to compare a whole lot of different forages at different cuttings and kind of give you a sense of their relative value. Okay. But those are dictated by the NDF and ADF content and the protein content. So I kind of look and the digestibility. So I'd say, you know, RFV, RFQ, understand RFQ is going to be more fair playing field for grasses. RFV works great for compare legumes. Those are probably pretty helpful ones to look at. And then NDF, ADF, and digestibility and crude protein. So I guess that's 6. Those are the main ones I'd be looking at. Yep.
Cool. So, and then the second part of that is, you know, I try to, you know, learn as much as I can about this over the years. And, you know, you look at different things and it'll have like TDN of 56 versus 51. Well, when you look at all these, what's the significant difference? You know, is that significant or not? Is it 1 unit? Is that significant, you know, like 53 to 54? Or how do you look at these when you're comparing them and go, okay, wow, that one is, you know, better?
That's a good question. It's interesting, you know, just remember another thing, not to get off topic, but like these are chemical indicators of their value, okay? Based on, you know, good science, but sometimes they lie. And you might get a forage that the animals actually do really great on, that its chemistry kind of belies its quality. And that does happen occasionally. So animal performance is the ultimate measure of forage quality, okay? But most of us aren't gonna, you know, measure. One way you can measure it is milking cows. You can get an instant readout on that. Most of us, you know, raising cattle or sheep, we're not gonna measure the daily gain differences that are subtle. But I would say, for example, for TDN, to answer your question more directly, I'd say, you know, the difference between 62, like 4 points is a pretty big difference. 2 points, kind of measurement error. But like if I get a difference of like 4, maybe 5 for sure, that's a pretty different forage. If I'm comparing 65% TDN to 70, that's pretty different. 68 to 70, they're kind of the same.
Okay.
So I'd say I'd look at it about that level of error.
And like, what about protein?
Protein's kind of similar. It's probably a little less prone to error. Protein's a little more precise because it's nitrogen content, and that is measured pretty accurately. So I'd say 1 percentage point in protein is pretty is pretty significant. So 2 for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So it's a more accurate indicator, whereas like ADF and NDF are decent, but they're not quite as precise. They don't quite translate to animal, you know, to performance quite the same. Energy content too, you know, if you want to look at another indicator, ADF, NDF, and then what you just said, TDN would be a pretty good, but they should be, you'll see, you start looking at all those and you'll start to see what the relationships are. Pretty much TDN is going to be dictated by ADF. But like most of us don't feed our animals based on ADF, we feed them based on TDN. So it's a little harder to maybe use as an index, but it definitely tell you about your quality of your forages too. They're perfectly related.
Thank you for listening to this webinar. Please stay connected. Join our mailing list. Select a subgroup that you want to join at the bottom. This one would be the Mid-Michigan Livestock Network. Again, thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar.